Okay, the top has all been sanded. Now there's a couple of steps that have to happen in sequence. One of the things I have to do is raise the grain of the walnut before I stain it. The stain is a water-based stain, and when it contacts and soaks into the wood, it causes the grain to raise, the wood becomes rough. So what we do is we put water on here first, let that dry, that raises the grain, we sand off the fibers back to smoothness, and then we can start going into the staining process. Now, I don't want any of that dark stain to penetrate into the maple, the curly maple, so I'm going to go ahead and do a little shellacking on the curly maple first here to begin with, to limit the chance of it absorbing some of the stain. Now, I'll also be shellacking the walnut after the grain raising evolution to help control the stain. So if I get a little bit of shellac onto the walnut, that's not a real big problem. The real goal here is to keep the maple from sucking up the stain. Now this is 1/2 pound cut shellac. I often call it shellac polish, which is what James Crenoff called it. It's 1/2 pound of shellac flakes per gallon of denatured alcohol. I mix it up with 1 ounce by weight per 1/2 pint of alcohol, which is the same ratio. And you have to do several coats of this if this is your final finish. In the case of this particular piece, the final finish on this will be varnish, polyurethane varnish rubbed in. So this shellac is just a kind of a pre-finish. Now I'm spraying on some water to raise the grain in the walnut prior to staining. Okay, so let's see, where are we? We've raised the grain, sanded that down. Then I put on a light coat of 1/2 pound cut shellac, and now I'm going to lightly sand that just to take away any little roughness. And then we'll go ahead and we'll stain the walnut. I'm using P400 grit sandpaper, which is the same grit I used just prior to the shellac. And the shellac, again, is just to allow the stain to absorb evenly into the walnut. And now I apply the aniline dye that we mixed up to match the right color for the walnut. And this has got to be done very, very carefully by hand, using a foam applicator to get the dye right up to the edge of the curly maple, but not on the curly maple. The water-based dye, so it has a tendency to soak into wood, which is the reason we sealed up the curly maple ahead of time, so that it wouldn't soak into the end grain, and that seems to be working well. As long as I'm careful to not actually apply any to the maple, I seem to be able to successfully create a sharp line. Let it soak in a little bit and then wipe off the excess. Try to get it as even as possible. And we'll probably end up doing a couple of coats on this. I'll do 1 coat, and then we'll see if there's any places where there's little defects that need to be fixed, and then another coat. until we get the color the way we want it. The main reason for using aniline dye on the piece is that it's transparent and the figure of the wood comes through. It's not obscured like if you were using a pigmented dye that basically is more opaque. But because it is a transparent dye and isn't simply a coating that obscures the finish, some parts of the wood absorb the dye differently than other parts. And so one of the advantages of aniline dye is you can come back later and adjust color. And for example, in this particular piece of veneer seems to have absorbed more dye than the others, and so it's darker. So what I can do is I can take a brush with a little bit of water and brush it in to that particular piece, and the water will then slightly dissolve the dye, and I can then rub that out with a cloth. And blend in the color. In other words, lighten it slightly, blend it in with the surroundings. And then thereby make slight corrections and try to get the coloring more uniform. You can also come back later if you don't like a particular color. You can use another color aniline dye on there and adjust the color. You know, if I wanted this to be a little different shade of brown, for example, I could use appropriate colors and apply the dye, and it would make adjustments. In this case, I don't have to do that. I'm simply just trying to even out the coloring. I'm well into the finishing phase for the top. Just to kind of recap, what we did was after the veneer was all applied, we sanded and then sealed with a light coat of half-pound cut shellac. Then did the staining of just the walnut. Didn't stain the curly maple. As a matter of fact, before I stained the walnut, I shellacked the curly maple to prevent the walnut stain from getting into the end grain and discoloring the curly maple. So then we, like I say, we stain and then put on a few more coats of thin shellac to seal. I used orange shellac on the curly maple to make the tone a little more yellow to match the rest of the desk. And now we're doing the coats of thin varnish. I just take semi-gloss polyurethane varnish, nothing special. I go down to my Ace hardware store and I buy either the Ace brand or the Minwax. They're both good for this. I mix it 50-50 with mineral spirits, and then I just rub it on and let it set for 20 minutes or so till it starts to thicken. I rub it in as good as I can, and when I'm at the point where I feel like I can't wipe it off without the rag sticking, I know that I need to wipe off. If I wait a little too long, I can always just rub on a little more varnish to loosen up what's there. The idea is at the end I want to have this wiped so it's smooth, it doesn't collect dust, has some tack to it because it's got a thin coat on there, and it'll be ready for the next coat. You've got to do this a number of times. When I made a buffet a couple years ago, I ended up putting 11 or 12 coats of this on there. But it makes it very controllable, and of course if you don't spray, I don't spray in my shop, I don't use spray finishes. So it makes it very controllable, and you don't have a lot of lint pickup, and you know what the finish is going to look like. Someone also asked me if this hurts my hands to wipe this in with my hands, and the answer is no. I've never been bothered by this. I do make sure that I'm ventilated for the fumes, but I'm not sensitive to the mineral spirits or the polyurethane varnish. wipe it on in. Feeling a little bit of roughness here, so probably before the next coat I'll just hit this with a little sandpaper, either 400 or 600 grit. I'm not trying necessarily to make a lot of tooth for the varnish, because it's so thin there's still enough tooth left, but I don't want to have roughness in the wood, and the grain still gets raised just slightly no matter what you put on. And the curly maple feels a lot smoother. It's a much tighter grained wood to begin with. If I let this sit for 20 minutes or so, rub it some more, and wipe it off, we'll be okay. Okay, this is about the point where my hand is starting to feel resistance as I rub. Now, I haven't been rubbing this entire time, by the way. I went and did some other things. I'm feeling some resistance, so I know I'm getting close to the point where I need to wipe off. Because if I wait too long, a rag has a tendency to want to stick to the varnish. And that's not the idea. So you don't have to put a whole lot of your mixture, 50-50 varnish and mineral spirits on here. I maybe put a little too much on this last time. Because all you end up with is a thin coat. That's all you're trying to get. Okay, so I just take a clean rag and start wiping it off. Okay, so I've got this pretty well wiped off. I'll come back with a dry rag and finish it off. Don't want to have any shiny spots left, and I want my last strokes to always be with the grain so that you don't leave marks. Now, this particular rag is pretty well saturated with the finish, and any finish that cures by reaction with oxygen creates heat. It's basically an oxidation. It's like burning, slow burning. You don't want fast burning. So take this rag, and I always lay them outside flat to dry in the air. You can also put them in a bucket filled with water, soak it real good. But whatever you do, don't just ball them up and leave them somewhere, or you'll come back and there'll be a fire. So that's about it, and we'll just keep doing this until the finish is nice, and we'll know when it's where we want it, and we'll stop. I'm getting ready to attach the top now, and I'm going to attach it with screws. I want it to be removable. Now, just to back up a little bit, you may recall that originally I wanted to make this carcass in pieces that could be moved individually, but once I realized how large it was, I decided it would be much better to assemble it in the shop and make sure it's aligned perfectly. But the top may have to be repaired in the future, and it would be easier to do that if it could be removed. So I'm going to screw it on with 21 screws. All but 3 of them are going to be these very long screws, and then I've got some shorter 2-inch screws that will go right along the front of the center drawer. Now, I had to very carefully drill pilot holes for these screws. The top is 1.5 inches thick. The screws will extend into the wood 1 1/4 inch. So I took my drill bits and marked with tape to a 1 1/4 inch length, and went around and carefully drilled the holes. I needed a little bit larger pilot for the larger screw. Now I'm going to go ahead and pre-drill these holes
so that later I can grind off the tip of these screws and still be able to get them into the hole. The reason I want to grind off the tip is just in case the screw pulls a little farther than I want. I don't want the tip going into the veneer, and I can easily grind off a 1/16 of an inch, and that just buys me a little wiggle room. You got to be very careful putting a top like this on to make sure that your screws don't A, punch through, or B, press the wood and make a dimple on the show surface. So I'll just go ahead and, starting from the corner, pre-drill these screws down to the 1 1/4 inch point. And that gives me a pre-tapped hole. Well, the top is now all screwed in place. Some of those really deep holes I had to use a little ratchet wrench here with a Phillips head bit and reach way in to get those screws tight, but it's on now. If you're following the whole sequence of these videos, you'll notice at this point things get a little bit out of sequence. In a follow-on video, we'll be talking about how to attach the front curve section, which is already attached right now, so please forgive me. It's just the way the production goes. So we'll see you next time.